All right, so today the Cold War. Conflict between the two nations to emerge from World War II as the two superpowers of the world. Two nations that had been allies during World War II solely because they had a common enemy in Nazi Germany. And as soon as that enemy is defeated, eliminated, and the war is over, the alliance collapses. Fairly quickly, the Grand Alliance between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the US and its allies, Britain and France on the other, collapses in the late 1940s. And by the 1950s, it is clear that there is some sort of state of simmering hostility and international competition, if not an outright all-in World War III conflict between these two, because as we'll see, the stakes would be too high for that. But what exists is a state of Cold War, a decades-long conflict within which there will be arms races between the two, constant preparation for that potential World War III scenario. There will be brinksmanship and gamesmanship, pushing things to the brink, testing the other side to see how far you could go without outright setting off a direct war. And then there will be proxy wars. Conflicts fought in other parts of the world between often warring factions within some country, in which the US takes one side and the Soviets take the other. And they supply them with training, money, weapons, and occasionally we'll look at a few examples of where either the United States or the Soviet Union will send their own troops to do battle in one of these proxy wars, but never both, because both would be direct war between the two. So, this is what I was speaking to a moment ago, the collapse of the Grand Alliance after World War II. Once Nazi Germany is defeated, I love the juxtaposition of these two photographs. Having a laugh, smiling, and then not so much. Once Nazi Germany is defeated, all you're left with is your stark ideological differences, your different worldviews. America is a capitalist nation, committed to international free trade. It wants other capitalist nations in the world to be good trading partners to America. Politically at home, even though it would become very obvious to everyone in the 50s and 60s that America has deep-rooted problems in fulfilling its promise as a liberal democracy, at least it has a liberally democratic constitution. The Soviet Union is a one-party police state with a totalitarian dictator. And the Soviet regime, it was believed, was committed to spreading revolutionary socialism or communism throughout the world, supporting communist revolutions throughout the world, to build itself up as the sort of preeminent nation in a communist world. At a minimum, the Soviet Union would like to surround itself with other communist nations so it is not the only communist nation in an otherwise capitalist sea. And so, put it together here, America is interested in seeing capitalism flourish in the world, the Soviets are interested in growing communism. And they start to get deeply suspicious of one another, even before the war is over. I think I spoke to this in here when we look at the conferences at Tehran and Potsdam and Yalta. Stalin is suspicious that Britain and America are purposely delaying the D-Day invasion to let the Russians do all the fighting. The U.S. starts to get suspicious that the Soviet Red Army is not going to leave Eastern Europe and actually liberate those countries, but instead take them over, and so on. And what you're left with when World War II is over is a pretty quick race to gain influence over the rest of the world. A kind of mentality that the world is about to devolve into two camps, with America the leader of one and the Soviet Union leader of the other, and who all is going to be on our side. If you're America, the question is who all can we count on as reliable capitalist allies, and if you're the Russians, it's where can we support the spread of communism. Nowhere is this divide more clear in the earliest years of the Cold War than in Europe. Whereas I just mentioned, the Soviet Red Army occupies the eastern half of Germany. The Red Army occupies Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. Russian troops ran the Nazis out of there, and now they control those areas. And it's effectively up to them what's going to happen there. It's up to Stalin and the Communist Party. American and British and French troops occupy the west of Europe. They more or less liberate those countries truly from the Nazis and allow those people to reestablish their governments as they see fit, and that leads to the reinstitution of capitalist democratic governments in these places. Mussolini is killed in Italy and gone. Nazis are gone in Germany. We'll look more closely at what happens specifically in Germany in just a second, but what the United States does to help rebuild those parts of Europe that it controls that are in ruins, and Europe economically was in ruins especially, and if you're America, you can't have that. Meanwhile, you're in a unique position if you're the United States, because remember, Lend-Lease, all of that war material that other allies borrowed on Lend-Lease, they're going to pay America back for that, oftentimes in gold, at a time when America's dollar was built upon, or rested upon a foundation of how much gold America had. So the U.S. comes out of World War II with the U.S. dollar now at the heart of the world capitalist system. You didn't have any destruction on your soil since Pearl Harbor. You won the war. So America emerges as this economic powerhouse, which is in a unique position to be able to implement the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is an economic aid or recovery plan for Europe. The United States, through the Marshall Plan, will pump some $18 billion into these nations in blue for economic recovery. And when it gives billions of dollars to Britain or France or the Netherlands or Belgium, it is granting them that money. And I don't have to tell students the difference between a grant and a loan, I don't think, right? What's the difference?
Grant you don't have to pay back.
Grant you don't have to pay back. So it's giving them this money, not to do whatever the hell they wanted with, though, mind you. The thinking was that these countries would then turn around and use that money to buy stuff from American companies that would help them generate an economic recovery. Buy factory equipment, buy fuel, buy fertilizer for the fields to generate an agricultural recovery, and so on. And so this would then benefit American corporations, right? So America is doing this to help them recover, not just magnanimously or altruistically, but because it's going to help America in turn as well. What's more, there's actually a second component to this. Let's just take one example. Let's take France. So you got USA Marshall Plan. You can see that there. And part of that Marshall Plan is going to be to grant, let's just for easiness sake, $1 billion to the French government. So what the French government then does is doles that out to French companies or French firms, which would then turn around and buy shit from American companies. Right? The genius here is not just that you're giving them this money to buy stuff from your company so it's great for America's economy. The second genius part is this here is, we call this the grant part here. Well, this is loan. From French government to French firm, that's a loan. So when these French companies start to recover, they turn around and pay the French government back. And that gives the French government a permanent fund for economic development. And all of this takes place here from French government to French firm back to French government in the local currency, the franc. And all these currencies had been screwed up by the war and devalued. And so not only does it help these countries and their companies recover, and it helps America's corporations and economies, it also helps to recover the value of these local currencies from the Deutsche Mark to the franc to the pound. Does that make sense? And it works. And America offered this aid to all the nations of Europe, including the Soviet Union, who of course politely declined, and then declined on behalf of each and every one of the countries that the Red Army occupied. So the Marshall Plan is only for Western Europe, from West Germany to Austria to Italy and over. You notice anything odd here? I keep meaning to correct that. I don't know where I got that map. That's obviously the Western Bloc in blue. Eastern Bloc is in red. Somebody either doesn't know their Eastern or West, or doesn't know their colors. I don't know.
I was looking at Iron Curtain.
Huh?
I was looking at the Iron Curtain.
Oh yeah, we'll talk about that for sure at length. First though, so if the Russians reject the Marshall Plan, which works great for Western Europe and for America, what happens there east of what would later be called that Iron Curtain? What happens in those countries? Well, the Soviet Union decides that they want a buffer zone. The Soviet Union says Russia has been invaded by Nazi Germany. Russia was invaded by Napoleon. We've been invaded too many times by countries from Western and Central Europe. We want a buffer zone. And look, Stalin eventually just more or less says, frankly, if we hold elections here, if we reinstall the governments that were here before the Nazis took over, they're not going to be friendly to us. They're not. What we want is communist governments. And we feel like if we hold elections, there won't be maybe communist governments. So what we're going to do, we're going to put communist governments in place. We're going to get rid of the old government figures, including executing them. And we're just going to install communist regimes that we can more or less control from Moscow, like puppets, puppet regimes. Communist governments in these countries, from Poland to East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, propped up, put in place by the communist government in the Soviet Union, and to a certain degree controlled by them for the next several decades. That makes these countries satellite states of the Soviet Union. Call them satellite states, and their governments are known as puppet regimes. I know it's a mixed metaphor, but bear with me. That all making sense? Winston Churchill, I mentioned before, his party is voted out of power in the United Kingdom, but he's still tremendously popular, including in America. And he comes to America on a speaking tour, and he gives a speech in which he tries to tell the American people what he had tried to tell his own people, that while they're sort of not paying close attention, an iron curtain is descending down the middle of Europe. He meant this as a metaphor to convey the reality that you had capitalist democracies in the West, and everything east of this line, thanks to the Russians, was where they were becoming communist dictatorships, just like in the Soviet Union itself. Every one of those was becoming a little miniature version of the Soviet Union, controlled by the Soviet Union, and propped up by the Soviet Union. And by the way, the Soviets' plan economically for Eastern Europe was literally the opposite of the Marshall Plan. They tell those people, we liberated you from the Nazis, you owe us reparations. And so instead of pumping resources in, they're sucking them out.
Is it like colonies? Like a.
They treated them like that, yeah, in a sense at first. And what's interesting is that and the general failures of state socialism over the years, Eastern Europe suffers very badly economically. You can still tell the difference today in terms of development. And obviously when times are hard like that and you live under a dictatorship, there are going to be uprisings against the government. Well, the Soviet Union rolls in with the Red Army and crushes those rebellions each and every time. Until they don't. We'll see what happens when they don't in the last lecture of the semester. Now, Churchill meant this as a metaphor, but that Iron Curtain eventually becomes something very real. This map is interesting or important because you can see the expansion of the Soviet Union through World War II. Yes, they established the satellite states here in Eastern Europe, the so-called Eastern Bloc. But two, in addition to Russia proper, Russia itself, the core of the Soviet Union, there are all these other Soviet socialist republics like states, which are now the independent nation states today, post-Soviet Union, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus or White Russia, Ukraine, down here in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and over here, as Borat would say, asshole Uzbekistan, his home of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. And then the other is just another look at the division of Germany. But let's look here for a minute at Germany specifically then. So initially, when World War II ends, so we take it back a minute, Germany is divided into 4 occupied zones as indicated in this map here. You have the British in the northern zone, the United States in the southern zone, the French are on a border zone of their own border, and of course the Red Army is in the east, so you have the Soviet zone in the east. Everybody getting along at this point. Note where the capital of Berlin is, though. It's right in the middle of the Soviet Eastern Zone. But it's the capital where everything happens. And so the Russians allow them, the French, British, and Americans, to have their own sectors of the city of Berlin. In other words, Berlin is divided up in much the same way that the country of Germany had been. Only it sits within the middle of that Soviet Eastern Zone. Does that make sense? Well, of course, if you have American personnel, British and French personnel working post-war in this part of the western half of the city, they need to travel to and from West Germany. There'd have to be supplies and things that came and went, and personnel that came and went. And if you're getting along with the Russians, that's no problem, if you're still allies. But what happens when Cold War sets in? Stalin gets pissed at you for one thing or another, and he decides to shut it down. I mean, he can't kick you out of West Berlin, but he can say no overland travel through our zone anymore. Thinking that cut off, that America, Britain, and France would simply pull their personnel out and let the Russians have West Berlin. But if they were to do that, you're dealing with, when you have a Stalin type of guy, you know that he's going to do, some Stalin type things, right? Could have said the same about Hitler. Understand, they are keenly aware of how appeasement had failed with Hitler. Remember? Well, we'll let him have Austria and the Sudetenland, and they will just promise he won't do any more things like that. Well, that had failed miserably and blew up in your face. 2, you have your own diplomats telling you from Moscow, we've been here for years, we understand the Soviet government, a Stalin type guy, Stalin type things. You can't back down to these people. You have to use force. You can't let them push you around. And so the thinking was, if you just removed your personnel from West Berlin, that's letting Stalin push you around. And it shows weakness. And the thinking was the Soviet government would capitalize on that weakness. But what do? If you roll with the tanks into the Eastern Zone, the Soviet zone, you're threatening to start World War III, and nobody wanted that. What you see here happen in Berlin is the first of a series of sort of middle ground responses to crises. They decide, okay, we got airstrips in West Berlin. why don't we fly supplies in supply planes, non-threatening, and if Stalin decides that he wants to shoot these planes down, then that's on them. And we're going to dare them to start the war because we don't think they'll do it. And they didn't. The Berlin Airlift is this genius response that allows you to hold on to your sectors of West Berlin despite Stalin trying to run you out. What's interesting about West Berlin, though, if you lived in the city, I mean, you might have people who lived in the other half, in the western occupied sectors. You might live in one sector, have a business in the other. So if you travel back and forth, you begin to see very clearly the differences of Soviet-style rule versus American, British, or French. In other words, you could tell, hey, not only is economically it not doing so good over here in the East, but they have a lot of freedoms over there that we don't have. We live under more or less a dictatorship. And they're installing an East German government that's a dictatorship just like they are. But over here in the West, we got relative freedom. So people start leaving East Berlin for West Berlin by the thousands, and not just East Berlin, but the surrounding parts of East Germany. Because West Berlin, it becomes clear, is this little pocket of not only economic success, but relative freedom. And if you're the East German communist government, and if you're the Soviet Union, you can't allow that. So they build a wall around West Berlin, not necessarily to keep the West Berliners in, but to keep East Germans out. And it is set with an armed guard, and anybody trying to go over, around, through, or under it, you're going to be shot and killed. And over the years, it becomes a symbol of the oppression of these communist regimes. So, what begins happening, it comes to light, new shit comes to light eventually, if you're the East German government, or of any of these other satellite states. You have to go, the government in a communist regime knows your every move and your whereabouts at all times, so you would have to go and get a pass to go on vacation. And people claim to be going on vacation in Czechoslovakia or Hungary, and go camping in the woods, and then they end up getting lost in the woods and just so happening to find their way across the border into Austria. So they're pretending to go on vacation and instead escaping across the border from a communist nation into a more democratic and free one. And once this becomes known to these governments, these communist governments, they end up building fences and walls, border fences, with armed guards and shooting anybody who would cross the border and keeping you in. And so my point here is that what Churchill meant only as a metaphor eventually becomes something quite real. If you look at these border walls and fences, the Iron Curtain does become something very real and again, symbolic of communist oppression. Question? America's foreign policy that it will develop to fight this Cold War is known as the containment policy. Containment is a sort of middle ground between, we're going to be so tough and stand up so much to the Russians, we're not even going to allow them to establish those puppet regimes. We're going to roll into East Germany and start World War III and liberate those countries and make sure they have free and fair elections. Not going to do that. But nor could you go back to isolationism and allow the Soviet Union to, of its own free will and accord, support communist revolutions all over the world, take over countries and install communist governments there outside of Europe perhaps, help try to spread communism in Western Europe. That's part of what the Marshall Plan was supposed to do. The thinking being if a country is doing well economically under a capitalist democratic government, there would be no threat of a revolution. But if they're doing very poorly, there might be, so let's make sure we get them going economically again. So communism can't spread beyond the borders where it currently exists. That's containment. Make sure communism does not spread beyond the current borders in which it exists. To put it another way, the policy is to contain the spread of communism wherever possible. To contain the spread of communism wherever possible. And so, to try to prevent communist revolutions from being successful. Or where they are, maybe trying to undo that. This policy is built upon a number of assumptions, some of which maybe turn out to be true and some of which maybe don't. But they were assumptions that people bought into at the time, and that's what matters. Some of them come from an influential American diplomat named George Kennan, pictured on the chessboard there. Kennan was working for the State Department in Moscow. He worked at the American Embassy in Moscow during World War II and after. He is not the ambassador, but he's still a high-ranking diplomat. And he was thought to be the guy who knew the most about the way the Soviet government worked. And so when it becomes clear that we're devolving from Grand Alliance into a state of Cold War, the State Department in Washington reaches out to the embassy and says, have your man Kennan prepare a paper for us, telling us everything he knows about the way the Soviet government thinks and how we should deal with these people if we're enemies and not allies. And Kennan responds with the now famous long telegram, parts of which I think you're going to read. Kennan, in his long telegram, says, look, I love the Russian people, love Russian culture, they're good people, this government is a shit government, I hate them, they're diabolical. He's the one that was saying, you got to deal with these people by force, that is a language they understand, and they can respect. They don't want to start World War III any more than we do, but you can't let them push you around. And then he begins to articulate this theory that because the Soviet Union feels encircled by the capitalist world, that not only would they support communist revolutions all over the world to support the spread of communism, which they did, but according to Kennan, in their mind, the world was not big enough in the intermediate or long term for capitalism and communism to coexist. And that eventually one of them would have to go. And that for the Soviet government, they clearly didn't want it to be communism. And if you believe that, then you believe the Soviet government is out to eliminate capitalism from the world. And it did not see it as possible at all for the Soviet Union and America to be any kind of cooperative, in any kind of a cooperative relationship for very long. To put that another way, or distill it down, Kennan is suggesting that the Russians are essentially out for world domination and to work against America's interests in every conceivable way, to try to eliminate capitalism from the face of the earth. Now, we know post-collapse of the Soviet Union, when the archives open up and historians can get into these documents, that was not really what the Soviet government was thinking. But what matters is that Kennan believed it to be true, and he convinces the State Department, who convinces the president that it is true, and this is what we formulate our policy on. So Kennan's message was, look, this is early on when he issues this telegram. He meant, you got to do everything you can to make sure communism doesn't spread in Western Europe. And he lived a long life and became a critic of this containment policy by saying, they took my words and ran with them. He said, I didn't mean you could contain the spread of communism literally everywhere in the world, which is where this is going. So you have to let Kennan off the hook a little bit. There's also one more assumption here, the domino theory. There's a thinking that if one country in one part of the world fell to a successful communist revolution, that others around it would then fall, like dominoes, right? So if, for example, you were to, as happens, lose China, there's a revolution that resumes in China and the communists win. And everybody says, Truman lost China, bad for Truman, and oh my God, now it's going to be Korea and then Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia and India and the whole damn East Asian region is going to go communist. If you believe that, if you believe what Kennan said about the mindset of the Soviet government and the idea that they think there can be no permanent peaceful relationship between America and the Soviet Union, and you put all this together, then the conclusion is that any communist revolution anywhere in the world, from Latin America to Africa to Asia, would play into the Russians' hands, would lead to the installment of a communist government that's just like the one in Russia, that's totalitarian, that this would aid the Russians in eliminating capitalism from the face of the earth. And so you could take from that the idea that a threat to any capitalist government anywhere in the world is a threat to our very own freedom right here in America. That is the essence of the Truman Doctrine, which essentially sells containment to the American people. Truman says a threat to, and he softens the rhetoric up. They don't want to outright say capitalist. He uses the rhetoric of free to paint this more as a struggle of freedom versus dictatorship. A threat to a free nation anywhere in the world, or a free institution, meaning a nation state. Threat to a free institution or free nation anywhere in the world is a threat to our freedom at home. And therefore, we must work to contain the spread of communism anywhere in the world we can. His thinking at that moment was to give a shitload of money to the nations of Greece and Turkey to fight communist uprisings, which we did, and successfully. But here's the thing, the governments of Greece and Turkey at that time were not exactly models of liberal democracy. And this shows you how the Truman Doctrine is going to play out in reality. And that reality is that the United States will support any government as long as the alternative is a communist one. We could list here 10 or 15 dictators easily that the U.S. supports over the course of the Cold War simply because they are not communist. So it's not really about free, liberal, democratic governments and freedom throughout the world. It's about who's a communist and who's not, and we'll back the guy who's not a communist, regardless of how they rule. Brutal dictator? Is he a communist? Okay, well, he's our guy. Got a ruthless authoritarian guy going to do a bunch of ruthless authoritarian things? That's all right, as long as he's not a communist. Might be a son of a bitch, but hey, he's our son of a bitch. This would be America's thinking when it would take sides in these proxy wars. But first, why Cold War? Take our minds back one more time to the end of World War II. Why not just fight it out with the Soviet Union, if you're Britain, America, and France, and have once and for all settled, who's got the dominant ideologies and institutions in this new world order? Well, number one, you had a generation of people who had just been a part of, in one way or another, the two most horrific wars in human history. Not a lot of people were itching for another fight that was going to be even worse. There's a lot of fatigue involved. Two, if you had been a part of both of those conflicts and you had held on to, in 1914, the idea that there could be a war to end all wars, if you had that illusion, you have now twice been disillusioned. There could be no one single war to end all wars. There would always be some other conflict. But let's be honest, the real and most fundamental, I guess I should say, reason why this war is a cold one is nuclear weapons. Not long after America drops atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and World War II is over, the Soviet Union successfully tests its own atomic bomb. No longer does America have a monopoly on atomic weaponry. And then in the 1950s, the United States successfully tests the substantially more destructive hydrogen bomb, which is not a atomic bomb. It is a thermonuclear weapon that uses not just nuclear fission and the splitting of an atom, but a combination of that and nuclear fusion to create a chain reaction that is, if harnessed correctly, could produce an explosion hundreds of times worse than the original atomic weapons. And if you remind me, I'll pull up the nuke map when we're done. I'll show you the difference between the damage that an original style atomic bomb could do versus what a thermonuclear weapon could do. It's actually horrifying. When you consider, too, that by the 60s, both sides have figured out how to deploy these weapons on missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, you no longer have to rely upon the range of your bombers, their ability to get into and out of enemy airspace. And the Russians will put ICBMs in Eastern Bloc nations and aim them at the West. America installs them in its Western allies and aims them at the Eastern Bloc and at Russia. Each side starts to build and build and build and build more of these things, committed to the idea of nuclear deterrence. The thinking being, if you're either the US or the Soviet Union, you want them to know at all times that you have just as many, if not more, nuclear warheads than they do, so that they would know if they launched a preemptive strike upon you and destroyed, let's say, 10 American cities, you could immediately turn around, perhaps even before those missiles had hit the ground, and destroy 10 or 11 of their cities, and that this was a guarantee to happen, right? So that might deter you or convince you, if you're the Russians in that example, not to do that, right? If you know the enemy has equal strength, you might think twice before initiating an attack. Well, that leads to a nuclear arms race. You catch up and you catch up and you catch up, and all of a sudden both sides have thousands of nuclear warheads. So that you have to think, if ever there was an all-out nuclear war between these two, you possess enough nuclear weapons that not only could you annihilate one another literally, the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, mutually assured destruction of one another, but that further, the radiation fallout from all of these strikes could potentially, theoretically, block out the sun and lead to the death of all life on Earth. Nuclear holocaust. Which seems like a pretty solid reason to avoid going to war with one another. We come close a few times. I think the one that we know the most and knew at the time the most about publicly is probably the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the early 1960s, when John F. Kennedy was president, American spy planes uncovered evidence that the Soviet Union was installing missile sites in Cuba. Cuba had, despite America trying to prevent it and trying to prop up the dictator there, Batista, there had been a successful communist revolution in Cuba. The Castro regime had come to power, and they turned to the Soviet Union for help. And the Soviet Union sends over these missile sites, and America discovers it and clearly can't allow it. It's one thing to have nukes aimed at your allies in Europe. It's another to have missiles that could hit Atlanta or Washington. But what are you going to do? You don't want to start the war any more than you want them to. And so there's a pretty tense couple of weeks there for the Kennedy administration trying to navigate this. Ultimately, what they do is they take the U.S. Navy and blockade Cuba, say they're not going to allow any more ships, Russian or otherwise, in, and demand that the Russians remove these missile sites that they're building. And in back-channel negotiations, agree to a sort of kind of face-saving move whereby if the Russians would remove their missiles, we would take some of our obsolete missiles out of Greece and Turkey that are on Russia's doorstep. And I throw all of that out there to say that was one moment where even the American public kind of knew we were on the brink. That, one misstep could result in a nuclear war. So needless to say, there's a lot of anxiety and paranoia on both sides. This cartoon encapsulates the Cold War. Everybody's got, your H-bomb, and they play on the absurdity of that catchy little name. Z-bomb, the Y-bomb. You got big-ass nukes. It says, on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. Nuclear deterrence. So what do? You fight it out with metaphorical bows and arrows. You've got these incredibly destructive weapons, but you fight proxy wars with conventional weapons instead. And you got kids in school doing air raid drills, being told to duck and cover, like that's going to protect you from being incinerated in a nuclear blast. People build fallout shelters out in the backyard so they could stock it up with canned goods so they could ride out in radiation fallout from a nuclear strike. Questions? All right. Once the Grand Alliance is a thing of the past, America moves to establish a new defensive alliance. An agreement between it and its industrialized allies in Western Europe and elsewhere, an agreement between those countries that, hey, if anybody attacks any one of our member nations, we consider that an attack on all member nations. The name of this defensive alliance is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Its members include America, Canada, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium. It's actually where it is headquartered today. West Germany at that point, because East Germany is under communist government. The Soviet Union responds by creating its own defensive pact, which consists of itself and the satellite states in the Eastern Bloc, signed in the capital of Poland and therefore referred to as the Warsaw Pact. If anybody attacked East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, so on, that's an attack on the Soviet Union and all the other nations of the Eastern Bloc. So in a way of looking at this, you could look at the world and say, all right, these countries in dark blue, America and its industrialized capitalist allies in NATO, that's the first world in the Cold War world. The Soviet Union and the industrializing nations of the Eastern Bloc and the Warsaw Pact, that's the second world. And everywhere else is the third world. Original meaning of the third world is the non-aligned world. Today it has the connotation of a poor, underdeveloped nation, because many of these Cold War era third world countries were nations that have been exploited for many years through imperialism and are in fact underdeveloped and poor. But third world meaning non-aligned, and so part of the Cold War, like I said at the onset, becomes this race to get those countries of the third world in your camp and not the other camp. Either through convincing them through propaganda and your actions that your ideology and system is simply better than the other, or more often by intervening in proxy wars and trying to affect the outcome. And there are going to be a lot of these proxy wars due to decolonization. Finally, after World War II, there is a backing away from imperialism, at least by most of the imperial nations. Some of them, like Britain, more or less willingly give up a lot of their colonies and give them independence. Where others don't, you see revolutions against continuing colonial or imperial rule. Where those countries do, for example, in Africa, become free and independent, oftentimes there are civil wars between factions who want to be the new leaders of the newly independent country. And in these civil wars, America will identify the most reliably anti-communist group. The Soviet Union will identify the most doctrinaire Marxist communist group. The United States gives their group money and training and weapons. The Soviet Union gives their group money and weapons and training and fuels these conflicts that would drag on for years. How is this soldier in Angola, an exploited nation under imperialism and not an industrialized nation, how does he have, a heavy machine gun? What looks like a 40 or 50 caliber machine gun. It's given to him by the United States. Same conflict in Angola. How do these guys have rocket-propelled grenades? Provided by either the Soviet Union or the United States. Well, I mentioned, and we're going to run down just a few examples, try not to get too tangential and into too much detail. But I mentioned that in some cases, either the U.S. or the Soviet Union would send their own troops to fight, and the first such case for America is Korea. Sorry. Korea is here. By the way, China here should be some shade of red because it has a communist government. But here are the Japanese islands occupied by America under American control, reliably capitalist. Soviet Union border is here, China is here, there is Korea. At the end of World War II, remember that Japan had controlled Korea for years, but Japan is defeated. So towards the end of the war, when Japan surrenders, America sends troops to the Korean Peninsula, but so did the Russians. And they controlled the northern half. It's like Europe. It's like the top half is controlled by the Russians, southern half America. So in the north, the Soviets do what they did in the Eastern Bloc and install a communist government. In the south, America backs a reliably capitalist dictator. At one point in the 1950s, the early 50s, with the backing apparently of both China and the Soviet Union, the north invades the south. And American containment says you absolutely cannot allow that to happen. And so not only would you back South Korea, you sent hundreds of thousands of American troops to fight in what would become known in America as the Korean War. A war in which some, I think, 50 or 60,000 American soldiers died. A war which eventually would involve Chinese communist troops fighting in Korea on behalf of the North. But containment is successful. The point was not to have the South then invade the North. The point was to defend the integrity of the capitalist South. And that continent remains divided at the, I think, 38th parallel still to this very day. So containment works there. That was the lesson you took from Korea. It might take a few years and 50, 60,000 dead American soldiers and might have to fight China over it too, but it worked. Until it didn't. I mentioned Cuba. U.S. tried to back a capitalist dictator there named Batista. That failed. Fidel Castro becomes the communist leader of Cuba with the help of his friend there, Che Guevara. Latin American Marxist revolutionary extraordinaire. I mentioned earlier Angola. Angola is here. It had been a colony of Portugal. Portugal didn't want to give up its colonies like Angola there and Mozambique over here. So they had to fight revolutions to free themselves of imperialist rule. Regrettably, once they have achieved that independence, they had warring factions trying to take control of the government. One of them was communist, and so they're backed by the Soviet Union, which necessitates America, for the containment policy, backing some group to stop them from taking over. Got to stop the spread of communism, got to contain it. So a civil war rages on in Angola for years and years, fueled by the United States and the Soviet Union. How does Africa become chock full of these kinds of weapons with a Soviet, Russian-made AK-47 or Kalashnikov assault rifle? Through these proxy wars. Ethiopia here, very similar situation. By the way, if you look at this map, red nation obviously means communist government, blue dot means anti-communist uprising. Conversely, blue means capitalist government, red means communist uprising. Guatemala, a government comes to power there that has the audacity to stand up to United Fruit Company and nationalize some of its land that they weren't using, that they had more or less stolen from Guatemalan people in the first place? Well, if you nationalize land, that looks like a revolutionary state socialist thing to do. That looks like it falls into the purview of the spread of communism aiding in the Soviet Union's plot. And so the American CIA engineers covertly a coup to overthrow that government and restore that land to the United Fruit Company. So sometimes containment could be carried out by your spies working behind the scenes. Then there's Afghanistan, which Afghanistan and Vietnam ought to be flip-flopped. Let me speak to Vietnam first. Like I was saying with the Portuguese, after World War II, didn't want to give up their colonies. France didn't either. And America makes the fateful decision to support its close ally, France, when it tries to take back control of Indochina. Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos had been a French colony. Japan overran everybody's colonies during World War II, remember? And you had a group of freedom fighters under the leadership of a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh, who had fought alongside the Allies to defeat Japan, to drive them out. And if you're Ho Chi Minh, who, by the way, quotes from the American Declaration of Independence, proclaiming Vietnam to now be independent, you're thinking, well, God, we've been ruled over by the Chinese for centuries, off and on. We were ruled over by the French, we were ruled over by the Japanese, and now we're free. And here comes France saying, not so fast, you're still our colony. Well, Ho Chi Minh resolves to then fight the French. They want to come back and try to control us, we'll fight them too. And it turns out to be a war that the French army can't win, even though the United States is basically bankrolling their effort. But the French eventually decide they have enough control in the south of Vietnam to install a puppet dictatorship, capitalist Vietnamese who were trained in France and spoke French and were Catholic like the French and would be friends with the French government. But they couldn't do anything about the north where Ho Chi Minh and the communists had control. So now we have a Vietnam that's just like Korea. Communist north, dictatorship, capitalist south. And if you're the United States, because you had backed France's war and you have this containment policy, you have a vested interest in making sure that South Vietnamese government stays in control. Despite the emergence of a group of Vietnamese communist revolutionaries in the South known as the Viet Cong, who will, with the help of the North Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese Communist Army, try to overthrow the South Vietnamese government. And now America finds itself sending troops over there. First, just advisors, then eventually large numbers of troops, then a massive bombing campaign trying to get the North Vietnamese government to quit the war through overwhelming force, killing a lot of civilians. And it's never enough. The U.S. has to face the reality containment did not work everywhere and every time. And you could spend 20 years and billions of dollars and kill a whole bunch of people, including having about 50 or 60,000 of your own soldiers die in a war that became incredibly unpopular with your own people. And you knew you would always be constrained that you couldn't use your most overwhelming force, nuclear weapons, because that invites the Soviet Union to retaliate. You had to face the reality that even though you are so powerful and a superpower, containment couldn't work everywhere and every time. Vietnam illustrated that vividly. And by 1973, America pulls its troops out, and by 1975, all of Vietnam was communist, and it remains so today. Only now, guess what? We can actually be friendly, reliable trading partners with a communist nation, which this shirt I'm wearing was probably made in Vietnam. I'm not even kidding. It might well have been. There are all kinds of problems with that, but it's not the time for discussion of the TPP. We'll leave that for later. Finally, Afghanistan. Afghanistan is here. Below all those other stands we talked about, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. Sits between those parts of the Soviet Union at that time and India and Pakistan. The Soviet Union at one point in the 1980s seeks to install and prop up in Afghanistan a communist government. Afghans resist that, and slowly but surely the Soviet Union finds that in the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan, and in the many sparse, far-flung villages, it's hard to control. And it becomes like their Vietnam. A massive, underdeveloped country determined to resist, and despite all of your technological superiority and firepower, you could not control it. And of course, if you're the U.S., your thinking is we can't allow the Soviets to just come in to swoop into another country and install a communist government. Containment says we have to fight against that. But the Soviet Union sent their own troops into Afghanistan, right? So we can't send our own, or that's World War III. So what do you do if you're America? Can't sit by and do nothing. So you support the Afghans who were fighting against the Russians. And you give them things like rocket-propelled grenades to shoot down Soviet helicopters up in the mountains, right? You send the CIA over to train them how to use that shit. You give them assault rifles and train them on those. You back them with money if need be. And you help them eventually drive the Soviets out, not long before the Soviet Union collapses. That's a scene from Angola, I believe, where Cuban revolutionaries came over to help train the communists in that conflict. This is an Afghan soldier. This is one of the great ironies of the Cold War. The United States arms and trains a group who consider themselves the Mujahideen. And I was on the last slide, and LG's going to destroy me for flipping back and forth so many times, and that's fine. The Mujahideen. Reliable guys who are going to fight for Afghan nationalism against the Soviet communist invasion with American support. Some of whom also consider themselves holy warriors. Ghazis, warriors of the faith, waging the jihad against the invading infidel. They're devout Muslims. Some of them followers of a deeply intolerant fundamentalist version of Islam, who would be among those who would be vying for power in the vacuum when the Soviet Union collapses, the government they were propping up collapses, and in the 1990s, Afghanistan becomes, like Angola had been, this place where you've got multiple groups vying for power. The people who win that war were among the leaders of the Mujahideen who had been armed and trained by the United States of America, who ended up ruling Afghanistan as the Taliban, with what I mentioned, a brutal and intolerant and fundamentalist and backward version of Islam, terrorizing their own people, and inviting into Afghanistan a follower of a similar kind of belief within Islam, a Saudi who was not welcome in his own country anymore, but had billions of dollars that he wanted to spend to more or less kill Americans. Osama bin Laden goes to Taliban Afghanistan to build Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization aimed at inflicting death upon America and driving the U.S. out of their part of the Muslim world. Culminating, of course, in a series of attacks that themselves culminated in 9/11. I'm connecting these Cold War policies with 9/11 to just say that we were so laser focused on containment that we armed and trained a group of individuals who were even then committed to such a deeply anti-Western ideology that they connected them to a maniacal, twisted version of the Muslim faith in which they would be more than happy to die in suicide attacks if it would kill Westerners. It just underscores the absurdity sometimes of the containment policy. In retrospect, we have the benefit of hindsight that they didn't have, in fairness. Questions? Anything at all?
Newt Mac.
Ah, yes. For once, I go to the computer not for Google Earth.
A different kind of map.
Yeah, that's true. Maps are important to me, Gabriel.
They are very. I wish they would teach us geography.
That's right. All right, here we are in Atlanta. Let's say, God forbid, someone had an old school, 1940s era atomic bomb like the one dropped on Hiroshima, and it landed right in the middle of downtown Atlanta. Okay, that's bad. The yellow in the middle, fireball radius, so parts of downtown business district and parts of GSU downtown would be incinerated. Nothing survives. Vaporized is the word. This ring is heavy blast damage, so fatalities within that zone are 100% and buildings are destroyed. Beyond that, you've got the thermal radiation radius where third degree burns for everyone. And then beyond that, you got the moderate blast damage, so there would be, like tornado style damage to buildings from Home Park and north of Georgia Tech to West End, down to Lakewood and over towards Kirkwood. That's bad. Okay, well, let's think about a thermonuclear weapon and what that would do. Oh, I had to zoom out a little bit, huh? So look here. Vaporized, everything literally vaporized and eliminated, entire city of Atlanta excepting Buckhead, which would be in the blast damage radius in which there are 100% fatalities and widespread destruction, which would include literally pretty much literally the entire metro area. From Kennesaw to Johns Creek to Conyers to Fayetteville and Douglasville. And then the burn zone extends beyond the metro area, as does the moderate blast radius, which would run from Rome to Athens to LaGrange. You're talking about millions of people dead, millions more injured. This is to say nothing of the radiation fallout and cancer and death from radiation. And essentially a large quarter of the entire state of Georgia destroyed. And we're talking about hundreds of these, thousands of these, depending on when we're looking. We possess, along with a few other nations, including today Russia, the ability to annihilate all life on Earth with the push of a few buttons. Pretty heavy stuff. Pretty horrifying, in fact, but this is the world in which we live. All right, well, if you have a dark and twisted mind, I use this word with all manner of understanding of the irony. It's fun to play around with. Like, what if a moderate nuke were somehow launched on Washington or New York? Again, pretty dark stuff, but it certainly will keep in perspective the world in which we live. All right.